The Birth of North Korea, 1946–1953. Reporter: North Koreans weeping and wailing, collapsing and mourning after learning of the death of Kim Jong-il. Narrator: this reaction may seem extreme to you, but to the people of North Korea, they were mourning their god. North Korea, the tiny, isolated country with the capabilities of mass destruction. With hostile relations in the West and increasing tension, will the Kim dynasty survive? The civilians adore and worship their communist dictator, or is this all a show? From the country's founding in 1948 to the modern-day totalitarian regime, this is the entire history of North Korea. The birth of North Korea, 1946 to 1953. Japanese-occupied Korea. The entire Korean peninsula was under Japanese occupation after 1905. Japan's occupation was unquestioned by foreign powers, and it presented its occupation as a civilizing project. For the Koreans, the story was quite the opposite. Thousands of guerrilla fighters bitterly resisted Japan until 1910, when they were all but destroyed, and Korea became fully part of the Japanese Empire. The story of Japanese-occupied Korea is one shared by many colonies. Industrialization and economic expansion came with discrimination against the native peoples as wealth and resources were siphoned away to the imperial masters. The initial guerrilla resistance was over, but the resentment of the Koreans did not go away. Japan ran Korea like a military colony, with armed teachers in schools and a massive militarized police force, overseeing all aspects of life. Also, like many colonies, they longed for independence. With the end of the First World War and all its promises of freedom, Korea agitated for its independence. Protests swept the nation in 1919, which the Japanese put down brutally. In one case, they locked hundreds of protesters inside a church and burned them alive. However, the tide couldn't be stemmed. The wave of Korean nationalism rose, and at its head were the communists. Dramatic music, the rise of Korean communism. Communist movements were common across the world. In the early 19th century, galvanized by the success of Vladimir Lenin in the Russian Revolution, the communists promised wealth redistribution, an end to profit-seeking and imperialism, and a new prosperous beginning for its people. Time would put those promises to the test, but the dream of the communist utopia enchanted countless people, especially in Korea. Korean communists quickly became the tip of the anti-Japanese spear. Numerous guerrilla and civil groups emerged in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, trying to achieve an independent communist Korea. The Japanese responded with firing squads, prison time, and terror. This killed many guerrillas and forced others to flee, including a young man the world would come to know as Kim Il-sung. The rise of Kim Il-sung. The rise of Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung was born in 1912 near Pyongyang. His early life is drowned in later propaganda, but it seems he was raised by Christian parents who escaped into China when he was still a child after getting involved in anti-Japanese activity. In China, young Kim fell in love with communist ideas. China had its own active communist movements, which Kim joined as soon as he was able. In 1931, he became a card-carrying member of the Chinese Communist Party and got involved with anti-Japanese protests and militant action. When Japanese forces invaded Manchuria in 1931, Kim joined the resistance, hoping to drive Japan out of China and eventually his homeland. Kim proved to be a successful guerrilla leader. He quickly worked his way up the ranks with successful strike after successful strike. Operating in both China and Korea in 1937, he led 200 guerrillas in the Battle of Pochombo, just across the Korean border, where his forces defeated Japanese soldiers and burned down a police station and other occupied buildings. The victory put Kim Il-sung on the map and made him one of the most famous guerrilla leaders in East Asia. For later North Korean propaganda, it was the true start of Kim's path to power. Kim himself wrote about the battle, saying that the flames over the night sky of Pochonbo in the fatherland heralded the dawn of the liberation of Korea, which had been buried in darkness. Kim and the Soviets. Kim's success earned him the nickname of the Tiger. The Japanese military sent out units to hunt him down and may have killed his secret first wife, which forced Kim to retreat into the Soviet Union, where he was officially enrolled in the Red Army and spent most of the Second World War in hiding. When the USSR declared war on Japan in 1945, Soviet armies marched into the Korean peninsula. Kim followed shortly after. At the same time, US forces landed in the south. After evicting the Japanese occupiers, the Allied powers decided to split Korea, much as they had done Germany. American officials chose the 38th parallel, a previously meaningless line on a map as the boundary between the two occupied zones. This line, apparently chosen in half an hour by two random American colonels, would become one of the most important borders in the world for the next 80 years. Korea had no natural north-south division, and everyone wanted a united Korean peninsula under their particular ideology, of course. The Soviets knew they would need a reliable Korean communist leader to achieve this, and Stalin personally chose the greatest of the Korean communist guerrillas for the job. In December 1945, Kim Il-sung became first secretary of the Communist Party of Korea, giving Kim power over his nation that he would hold for the next 50 years. The Kim deception. Kim had risen from lowly guerrilla fighter to leader of his nation. Or had he? A bizarre conspiracy theory claims that the Kim Il-sung who entered North Korea in 1945 was not the same one who led the Battle of Pochonbo. According to this theory, after the real Kim Il-sung fled into the USSR, Stalin made him disappear, like so many other communist figures who threatened his popularity. It sounds crazy, but a CIA investigation into the theory concluded that it was right. They believed that the Kim Il-sung in North Korea was a criminal who the Soviets blackmailed into assuming a false identity so they could manipulate him. A Soviet officer who worked with Kim also wrote privately that the later Kim was an imposter whose name was stolen from the famous guerrilla leader who had actually died years earlier. These days, historians think the theory is nonsense. Several people who knew Kim as a guerrilla confirmed that it was the same man. The CIA report had simply been wrong, which happens far more often than the CIA likes to admit. Still, it's not impossible that the entire Kim dynasty is built on a Soviet lie, a divided Korea. Kim the guerrilla and Kim the first secretary were probably the same, but no such unity existed for Korea itself. Under two contrasting governments, the Korean peninsula became a flashpoint for the new Cold War between communism and capitalism. In the south, General John R. Hodge Ranthi, U.S. Army's military government of Korea, while Kim acted as the figurehead for a Soviet-backed government in the north. Historians have often overstated the power of the Soviets in the north. Modern scholars accept that after 1946, Kim Il-sung and the North Korean Workers' Party were leading the way in setting North Korean policy. Kim began a series of communistic reforms in his nation. In March 1940, he began seizing land from landlords without compensation and redistributing it to the people, remaking the North's economy in a matter of months with 1,000s of new small peasant holdings. He set out a 2-year economic plan to guide production and investment, relying on new levels of state control over the economy and a focus on heavy industry. All industry, banks, communications, and transport infrastructure was nationalized. And in July 1946, Kim introduced a sexual equality law that guaranteed equal working rights for women. The reforms were successful, and North Korea saw an incredible economic recovery in the first few years after 1945 divided communists. All was not easy within North Korea, though. Different factions of communists threatened Kim's control, and each tried to push North Korea in their own direction. Kim's Kapsan, or guerrilla faction, held power for now. As the name implies, they were mostly made up of former guerrilla fighters whose effectiveness had earned the faith of Stalin But Stalin's faith was awfully fragile. This made the Soviet Korean Communists a particular threat. Made up of ethnic Koreans with Soviet citizenship, they leaned heavily towards Moscow. While they hadn't proven their effectiveness enough to earn Stalin's favor, the heavy involvement of the Soviets made them a risky rival for the young Kim regime. Then there was the Yan'an faction. This was a Chinese-aligned communist wing, most of its members being part of the CCP. After Mao's communists took power in China in 1949, the Yan'an faction became a potent threat to Kim's Korea-centric approach that threatened to pull North Korea towards Beijing. Last, there were the South Korean communists. Many had fled the South when the American troops arrived and made it their main goal to reunify the peninsula under communist rule. They were less of an immediate threat until reunification was achieved. But their leader, Pak Han-yong, was the closest thing Kim had to a rival. Pak and Kim had both been invited to Moscow in 1946 for Stalin to judge which was the suitable leader. While Kim had won out, Pak remained a force to be reckoned with. Foundation of KPA. Unsurprisingly, Kim anchored himself in the military. He'd been a guerrilla fighter for decades and made it a huge part of his ideology, so much so that the foundation date of his anti-Japanese guerrilla force, April 25th, became an annual holiday. This guerrilla force was officially transformed into the Korean People's Army, known as KPA, in February 1948. Conscription was in place from the outset, which meant that the KPA has always been a formidable force. Arming such a massive army was a tall order, but the USSR ensured that it was done by pouring weapons, tanks, planes, and artillery into North Korea with a huge numbers and modern equipment. The KPA was one of the most powerful military forces in the post-war world. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea is born 1948. Meanwhile, the newly formed United Nations tried and failed to settle the Korean Peninsula problem. The USSR opposed free elections and refused to cooperate with the UN, believing that they were puppets controlled by the US. The UN proceeded to hold elections only in the South. And on the 15th of August, 1948, the Republic of Korea, that being South Korea, was born under the leadership of Syngman Rhee. As far as the UN was concerned, this was the only true Korean government. North Korea responded by writing their own constitution. On the 9th of September, they declared themselves as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with Kim Il-sung as premier. North Korea, as we know it today, was finally here. The Korean War, invasion. Almost immediately, Kim started planning the reunification of the peninsula. With most American troops withdrawing in June 1949 and the vastly superior northern military at his fingertips, it looked like an easy win. Communism had also seen a string of recent victories that boosted Kim's confidence too. The USSR detonated their first atomic bomb in August 1949, which ended America's unchallenged nuclear supremacy. In China, Mao's communists overthrew the Republican government and gave them another communist ally. Both Stalin and Mao threw their support behind an invasion, and Mao sent at least 50,000 men from the People's Liberation Army to support him. Although Stalin was clear that he would not send in the Red Army, the South expected a war. There were several clashes in 1950 that proved hostility between the two Koreas. Then on 25th of June, 1950, North Korean tanks, planes, and infantry poured over the border in a massive assault. The Northern Army outnumbered the poorly equipped South 2-1, its air force by more than 10-1, and North Korea's almost 300 tanks met a grand total of 0 units of South Korean armor. South Korea utterly collapsed. Within 5 days, Kim controlled Seoul. Almost 80% of South Korea's army was captured, killed, or had deserted, and the tiny handful of U.S. troops on the peninsula could do nothing but run in the face of the North's overwhelming advance. As they went, North Korean forces targeted ideological enemies in South Korea. Politicians, anti-communist intellectuals, and business leaders were systematically exterminated by the KPA. Kim Il-sung was beyond pleased. It appeared he'd won a great victory, but that euphoria was short-lived. The Korean War, U.S. retaliation. The United Nations condemned the invasion immediately, and 2 days later, it approved a unified military response to the crisis. Naturally, the U.S. took the lead. Washington was worried that the fall of Korea to communism would threaten Japan and cause a domino effect in the rest of Asia. General Douglas MacArthur, who'd led U.S. forces in the Pacific theater of World War II and currently oversaw U.S. forces in occupied Japan, was given overall command of the UN coalition forces. UN forces landed at Incheon on the 15th of September, 1950, in the largest amphibious assault since World War II. The UN attack shattered the KPA. The North Korean front collapsed, and tens of thousands of KPA soldiers were captured. The UN quickly retook Seoul, and by the end of September had pushed back to the 38th parallel. By that point, most of North Korea's army had been killed or captured. In October, UN forces pushed into North Korea itself. Kim and his government were forced to flee, and Pyongyang fell to UN forces within weeks. What it looked like, a victory, was quickly becoming a total defeat. The Korean War. Strategic bombing. For North Korea, the true story of the war was not on the front lines, but at home. As its armies collapsed, so too did any hope of controlling the air, UN-aligned. Air forces quickly established dominance in the skies above North Korea and used it to devastating effect. The U.S. Air Force led a colossal bombing campaign that devastated North Korea's population and infrastructure. Entire cities were flattened. Villages were wiped off the map. Pyongyang was so badly bombed that not a single major building was left standing. The U.S. general in charge of the Air Forces said that by October 1950, the Air Force stopped sending bombers out simply because there was nothing left to bomb. An estimated 80% or more of North Korea's buildings were flattened as more explosives were dropped on North Korea than were dropped in the entire Pacific theater in World War II. Maybe 10% of the North Korean population was killed by the bombing. It is this experience, more than anything else, that shaped North Korean attitudes to the U.S. after the war. Whatever ideological disagreements they might have, and whatever nonsense propaganda the regime puts out, it is the near-total leveling of North Korea by U.S. bombing that explains the sheer hatred for the USA that pervades the North Korean state and society. The Korean War, Chinese intervention. Things improved for the North Korea when China stepped in. China had warned the UN forces not to get too close to its territory. And on the 25th of October, 1950, they decided that enough was enough. Tens of thousands of Chinese troops burst across the border and surprise attacked the UN forces. The UN was caught unaware and retreated in the face of the sudden attack. Chinese and North Korean forces quickly recaptured Pyongyang, pushed the UN back over the 38th parallel, and even retook Seoul for a short period. Kim Il-sung's feelings were mixed. On the one hand, North Korea was back under his control, but the strength of the UN forces made reunification unlikely. Kim resented the loss of so many of his troops and the fact that China was doing most of the fighting. Furthermore, both Stalin and Mao blamed the KPA for being too incompetent to win and causing the war to spiral out of control. Un forces soon regrouped and pushed back. Seoul was retaken in March, its fourth and final conquest in less than a year. And once again, it was the Communists' turn to retreat north with thousands of their soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. The UN reached the 38th parallel again in July 1951, and there the war would stall for 2 brutal years. The Korean War, stalemate, and armistice. From July 1951 to July 1953, the Korean War was a stubborn stalemate that was as grueling and frustrating as the trenches of the First World War. Casualties continued on both sides, but no significant territory changed hands. After several failed attempts to negotiate, both sides finally came to an agreement on the 27th of July, 1953. it was not a peace treaty, but an armistice. Both sides agreed to halt military operations, release prisoners, and returned the remains of the deceased. The armistice set up an internationally monitored, demilitarized zone, the Korean DMZ, along the border to mark the boundary between the two nations. The war has been left unfinished ever since. Skirmishes and episodes of violence have broken out. But for the most part, North and South Korea have been locked in a tense standoff that has threatened to spill over into a devastating war at any moment for the last 70 years. The rebirth of North Korea, 1953-1970, the rebirth of North Korea. 1953 to 1970, North Korea emerged from the war a broken and battered nation. Its army was almost destroyed. Its cities were in ruins. Its population was exhausted and demoralized. Kim Il-sung and his regime now faced the monumental task of rebuilding their country and navigating the perilous Cold War world. It was a task that required a fresh start, a rebirth of North Korea for a brand new age. Rebuilding a nation. The war devastated North Korea socially and economically. Overall economic output fell by 75% from 1949 to 1953. Output of energy, fuel, chemicals, metallurgy, and agriculture was a fraction of what it had been before the war. North Korea needed a rebirth, and Kim Il-sung set out the ways in which they'd achieve it. In 1953, he clarified 4 goals that would guide the nation in the coming years. First, he would consolidate what he called the People's Democratic System. In simpler terms, this meant doubling down on communist ideology and ramping up the propaganda to ensure that everyone was a loyal citizen. Second was to rebuild the economy and improve people's living standards. With much of the country in ruins, this was an obvious goal, but it would be a monumental task. Still, with total control over the economy and the support of their foreign allies, Pyongyang was confident it could be achieved. Third was to improve national defense. The army had to be rebuilt. The border had to be properly fortified, and they needed to secure modern equipment to stay competitive in a changing world. Last but not least, the unending goal of reunification remained. Kim's hopes had been shattered during the war, but he and other North Koreans remained convinced that it was possible. North Korea had its work cut out for it. Post-war purges. One of Kim's first priorities was repairing the damage his ideology took from the war. The North Korean Workers' Party had lost many members during the conflict, so he funded massive re-education programs to bolster the party's ranks and reaffirm their ideology, ensuring the party's long-term survival. However, the more serious damage was to the North Korean Worker Party's prestige. The Communists had presided over a failed war that had not reunified the country as promised, and communism itself had been rejected by the South Korean masses who failed to rise up to support their northern invaders. Kim decided to redirect blame for those failures towards his internal rivals. By scapegoating his enemies, Kim redirected popular resentment away from himself and towards the rival communist factions. By removing these people from power, he crippled his internal enemies and could fill government positions with his own allies instead. It was transparent and predictable, but it was awfully effective. The Soviet Korean Communist leader, Ho Ki faced Kim's wrath towards the war's end, when he was purged of his posts and blamed for a series of failures in the country's response to the war, especially the slow repairs of dams and infrastructure bombed by the Americans. The accusations drove Ho Ki to suicide, or so the regime claimed. Another victim was Kim's old rival, Pak Hon-yong. The leader of the South Korean Communist faction had been appointed foreign minister and had promised Kim that the Southerners would rise up and join the North when their communist forces rolled in. This obviously did not happen. Kim dismissed him from his post in 1953 and then had him arrested on accusations of being an American spy. Only disloyalty, the regime argued, could explain such a complete failure. He was given a show trial and executed in December 1955. Hundreds of communist figures found themselves fired. imprisoned or executed in the months after the war in a similar fashion, and Kim's grip on power became ever tighter. Juche ideology. With Kim's power almost unchallenged, it fell to him to decide how North Korea would proceed. He formulated an ideology that would guide his country into the future, an ideology called Juche. Juche was and remains the guiding principle of the entire country. Its elements were first expressed in a 1955 speech by Kim Il-sung, and it essentially means self-reliance. North Korea strives to be militarily, socially, and economically capable of standing on its own 2 feet. Cooperation with fellow socialist states was welcome, but dependence undermined the country's power. Economically, this meant a rejection of international trade as the path to prosperity, and a focus on self-sufficiency. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea would strive to grow all of its own food, develop all of its own technology, and extract all of its own raw materials. Socially, it meant a thorough education in Juche ideology for all citizens, and an insulation from outside ideas that might compromise the ideological unity of the nation. All of this, of course, was in a Marxist-Leninist framework, but Kim stressed that Korean thought and experiences should determine how those Marxist-Leninist ideas would be applied in practice. Juche also defined the North against the South. For Kim, the North was a fiercely independent nation that stood on its own, while the South was an American puppet shackled to its trading partners and military alliances. However, Juche is more than a practical philosophy. It's also an intense love of North Korea. One historian of North Korea described Juche as an assumption that Korea is at the center of the world. All citizens of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea must passionately love their country, and by extension, its leader. Understanding Juche is the key to understanding modern North Korea. Kim's cult of personality. North Korea had a goal and a means of attaining it, but it also needed a center to anchor the whole system, and Kim made himself that center. The 20th century was already no stranger to dictators whose personality cults consumed their nations, but Kim Il-sung's cult would put all of them to shame. The level of worship Kim and his descendants receive in North Korea to this day is one of the most striking and disturbing aspects of the regime. At first, Kim was following in the footsteps of his contemporaries like Mao and Stalin. In 1953, he declared himself Suryong, or Great Leader, and became a sort of embodiment of the nation. However, that amount of power and prestige could make anyone unhinged. Furthermore, by becoming the representative of the nation, any attack on Kim became an attack on North Korea. And in a country that emphasized loyalty to the nation, loyalty to the dictators was an inevitable consequence. This cult quickly grew out of control. It became illegal to write over a photo of Kim Il-sung or to wrap things in newspapers that just mentioned his name. It was even an offense to print his photo on poor quality paper. The August faction incident. However, the ruler cult almost brought Kim down before he really began. After the death of Stalin, the USSR took a hard pivot against leader cults. In February 1956, the new Soviet leader Khrushchev openly denounced Stalin and his personality cult, along with any other leaders who tried to emulate it. Still dependent on Soviet aid and support, Kim was forced to obey when Khrushchev summoned him to Moscow to be privately scolded for his own ruler cult in the summer of that year. In his absence, Soviet and Yanan non-communist factions hatched a conspiracy. They shared Khrushchev's disgusted with the ruler cult and called Sung out for his arbitrary punishment of dissenters. They also criticized his regime's economic policies and his bias towards his own guerrilla faction of communists. When Kim returned for the annual party meeting in late August, he was met with condemnation by the leaders of the other factions. Pak Chang-ok, leader of the Soviet faction, and Choe Chang-ik, leader of the Yanan faction, along with several of their allies, took to the stage at the party conference and tore into Kim as a tyrant and egomaniac whose actions were undermining socialist principles. But Kim's enemies had miscalculated. The Soviet and Yanan factions were too anchored in the USSR and China for their support. Meanwhile, Kim was a nationalist hero, a true Korean who had fought the guerrilla fight to free his nation. For many, Kim represented yusha, self-reliance, while his enemies would submit North Korea to the powers of foreign nations. At the party conference, Kim's critics were shouted down. They overestimated their support, and the party voted to expel Chua Chang-ik and Pak Chang-ok. Over the following months, dozens of leaders from both factions disappeared as Kim purged everyone he could lay his hands on. It is unknown how many people died, but it was so bad that Beijing and Moscow sent a joint delegation pleading with Kim to stop the purges. Kim simply ignored them. Most just disappeared. They were forgotten in hard labor camps or shot and buried in an unmarked grave. About 11 people were convicted in show trials and executed as enemies of the state. By 1960, Pak and Cho were dead, the Soviet and Yanan factions had been completely destroyed, and there was no one left in North Korea who would dare challenge Kim Il-sung's power. The three-year plan, 1954 to 1957, with politics dealt with, Kim turned towards economic issues. In August 1953, he set out his vision for a three-year plan to run from 1954 to 1956. Kim laid out investment plans to boost the nation's economy. Heavy industry was the main priority, with over 80% of all industrial investment going to sectors such as mining and construction. Plan also set out extensive quotas for every industry and directed workers to devote themselves to laboring for the state. According to Pyongyang, it was a success. Industrial and agricultural production had returned to their pre-war levels by early 1957. However, external observers noted that the numbers were probably skewed. Thanks to all of that investment, heavy industry had probably improved beyond pre-war levels, but vital industries like agriculture and fishing had not. In reality, the focus on quotas and output had devastating consequences. Like China, during the Great Famine, the regime exacerbated its own problems with its focus on quotas and numbers. Regional officials who failed to meet agricultural quotas were punished. So officials were incentivized to lie. This continued at each level, lie piling upon lie, leaving Pyongyang with a completely warped view of the country's actual state. This was especially bad for farmers who would have food seized by the state based on exaggerated reports of food output, which produced a famine in 1955 that killed thousands of people. This disaster was hidden from the non-communist world, but Pyongyang's allies in Beijing and Moscow were deeply concerned. The truth about the famine could harm communism's image abroad. Both countries sent food aid, but not enough to make up for the deficit. The regime worked hard to bury all evidence of this famine, and it was only in the 2000s when historians began combing through the Soviet archives that its existence was rediscovered. Data is incomplete, but an estimated 800,000 people died between 1954 and 1955. The East German government at the time believed that as many as 25% of North Korea's children had starved to death. The 5-year plan. Declaring the plan of success, Kim followed it up with a 5-year plan from 1957 to 1961. While the farmer was for reconstruction, this new plan focused on developing in a new direction and bringing North Korea into modernity. The first plan had been great for industry, but the common people still lacked food, housing, and clothing. Pyongyang was still too obsessed with heavy industry quotas over agricultural output. Both China and the USSR criticized Kim's plan and urged him to change it. But Kim stayed his course. The Cholima Undong, or Flying Horses campaign, was Kim's way of ramping up production. It was a massive propaganda campaign to encourage productivity and gave out rewards such as medals for factories and workers who exceeded their monthly quotas. Workers could also be organized into teams and compete with other teams for maximum output. They may be communists, but even North Korea realized that competition could be good for the economy. The press was filled with these Cholima riders, whose hard work was held up as a symbol of true patriotism. Kim also took to visiting production sites to encourage and inspire the workers, which became huge propaganda features for the regime. Another key part of Kim's motivation campaign were on-the-spot guidance visits, where Kim would visit farms, factories, or other facilities to motivate workers. According to the propaganda, he would use his immense wisdom to instruct the workers how to be better at their jobs and achieve their quotas. On the spot, guidance has become one of the most iconic parts of regime propaganda and has been kept up by all of Kim Il-sung's successors. Their motivation campaigns were combined with nationalization and reorganization that tightened state and party control of the economy. By 1958, North Korea had collectivized every farm, and by the following year, it had reached full nationalization of all industry and trade. The obsession with quotas and productivity also had its dark sides. The pressure to exceed and expand led to punishment and social consequences for workers or teams who fell behind. The government even started a Drink No Soup campaign, encouraging workers to not eat or drink as much so they wouldn't have to go to the bathroom during work hours. The 5-year plan, success or failure. So was it all a success? It's not so simple. The more Kim pushed, the more the workers were exhausted. The quality of work started to decline, even as the quantity increased. Kim complained that companies were being lazy and would rush to meet their monthly quotas with shoddy workmanship of goods and materials. And by the late 1950s and early 1960s, production growth had stalled again. In theory, by 1959, North Korea had met its production quota, and the government declared the plan completed ahead of schedule. The big picture numbers definitely looked great. The North's per capita GDP was $140, well above the South's $81, and many industries had seen increases in production by 50% or more. However, the GDP was inflated by industrial output at the expense of the food, clothing, and housing that Kim claimed to prioritize. The average North Korean remained wretchedly poor, living in temporary shanty towns, and many of them suffered from malnutrition. Industrial development came before the well-being of the people. The state also altered the numbers to not count industries such as coal, steel, copper, and fertilizer, which had all failed to meet their plan targets. Grain output was also curiously absent from the official 1959 statistics. It's telling that the government immediately planned a year of adjustment in 1960 to try and rebalance the numbers in preparation for a new phase of economic planning into the 1960s. And never again would North Korea publish thorough data about its economic situation. Songbun, class system. Alongside economic reorganization, the 1950s saw a social reorganization with the introduction of the Songbun system. Songbun is essentially a caste system that is still upheld in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It was launched in 1957 to distinguish between those families who were always loyal to the regime and those who were not to be trusted. There are 3 overarching classes in the Songbun system. The core comprise about 28% of the population, made up of those people descended from the original guerrillas and revolutionaries, the soldiers who died in the war, and those from traditional peasant families. This group is seen as the most loyal and trustworthy. They will be allies to the end. The largest group at 45% are the wavering. This includes the foreign-born population, families of defectors, members of the middle classes and their families, and a number of regular occupations like small traders and teachers. This group is not necessarily disloyal, but they cannot be trusted to be completely devoted to the regime. If things take a bad turn economically or politically, the regime knows that these people might turn against them. Lastly, roughly 27% of the population belong to the hostile class. Political prisoners, religious people, supporters of the South or the descendants of businessmen, and landlords all belong to this group. These people are not to be trusted, must be closely monitored for any hint of disloyalty or anti-communist action. Every North Korean is sorted into one of these classes, and then sorted into one of 50 subcategories within it. Those higher up the songbun scale can expect privileges, and having good songbun is the key to a good life in North Korea. On the other hand, those with bad songbun can expect to be discriminated against. Songbun affects everything: what jobs one can have, who they can marry, what healthcare they have, what schools they can get into, and even how much food is distributed to them. The regime maintains a file on every North Korean above the age of 17 to keep track of their songbun. Good deeds might move one up the songbun scale, but moving up is much harder than moving down. Missing work quotas, committing a crime, or showing any disloyalty to the regime are always bad for your songbun. Propaganda overdrive. Amidst this social and economic reform, the regime kept pumping out propaganda to tell citizens that they were fortunate to live in the greatest nation on earth. The regime claimed that North Korea was a paradise, free from the miseries that affected other lesser nations. According to one kindergarten teacher, there was no such thing as blindness or deafness in North Korean children, because those were failures of the pre-revolutionary world. According to school teachers, students never missed a lesson and never misbehaved. There was no such thing as alcoholism or prostitution in North Korea, because everyone had what they needed and never had to stoop to such lows. Divorce, that never happened. Neither did premarital sex. And of course, it wouldn't be a communist utopia without a complete absence of homosexuality, which the regime saw as an anti-socialist perversion. The truth was quite different. The regime took care to hide its flaws from the eyes of the world, even its own people, while trumpeting its supposed success to the stars. But there was something sinister behind this image of perfection. One visitor to North Korea noted that despite the war being recent and causing 1,000s of injuries, he never saw a single person who was scarred, mutilated, or disabled. The question was obvious. He said, "What have they done with them all?" The truth was that anything or anyone that made the regime look bad or question its image was taken out of the public eye. Some were merely hidden, but others would see the dark underside of the Kim regime. Punishment. In North Korea, punishment. In North Korea, a regime like North Korea needed ways to punish dissenters and the elaborate system of prison and labor camps first, set up by Kim Il-sung's government, are some of the most effective and terrifying examples in the world. It is easy to end up in a North Korean prison. The slightest accusation of disloyalty or anti-socialist activity from a party official or someone higher up the songbun scale could be enough for someone to be swept away by the police. Trials are a little more than ideological performances where the judge can berate the accused for being a traitor and enemy to North Korea, before being inevitably sentenced to several years in prison. The North Korean prison system borrowed heavily from Stalin's infamous gulags. They were designed to handle not only regular criminals, but political dissidents, whose only crimes were against the ideas of the regime. Virtually all North Korean prisons were and are labor camps. Inmates are subjected to forced labor to produce goods or extract raw materials for the regime. This ensures that the inmates' labor isn't wasted in idleness, and in theory, gives them labor skills and work ethic that those who are lucky enough to be released might remember when they return to society. Many prisons also serve as re-education camps. These places are known as kyowaso. Then there are concentration camps for political prisoners, known as kwanliso. These are for the prisoners for whom re-education won't work, and only hard labor or total isolation are suitable punishments. Political rivals, such as those purged after the August faction incident, dissidents, critics, attempted defectors, and sometimes the more serious violent criminals are likely to end up in these camps. Prisoners in all camps are subject to poor living conditions and barely enough food to survive. Beatings are a common punishment, and one former camp guard estimated that at least a third of inmates were mutilated, losing fingers, ears, or eyes to guard beatings. That same guard recalled that as far as the regime was concerned, Inmates are not humans, and there are no human rights protections for anyone in North Korean captivity. With Kim's power secure, the economy recovering, society realigning along socialist lines, and all of the opponents rapidly ending up in camps or graves, North Korea entered the 1960s with everything to play for. Challenges and triumphs. 1961-1973. Challenges and triumphs. The Great Leap Onward. As the new decade dawned, North Korea continued to strive for economic and military progress. Kim still wanted to improve heavy industry and compromised on the policy of Yusha to import equipment to support these economic sectors. The USSR was initially their main supplier, but friction over pricing and other issues led North Korea to do the unthinkable, turn to the West. Pyongyang realized that it was cheaper for them to buy industrial plants and machinery equipment from the West or Japan. Often, these goods were of much higher quality than the Soviet models. Kim declared the Great Leap Onward policy a way to use Western technology to jumpstart Korean development. They imported billions of dollars worth of equipment on credit, including $1 billion from Japan alone. Western businesses were happy to embrace a new market for the goods, and the fact that they were snubbing the Soviets didn't hurt either. In turn, North Korea used the equipment to establish the world's largest cement factory, as well as production facilities for steel, paper, fertilizer, and chemicals. Overall, the West went from almost nothing to being over 40% of total North Korea trade. These brief years of interaction in the 60s and 70s soon faded. However, when it became clear that the North Koreans who had been buying everything on credit were never going to pay it back. Defection of James Joseph Dresnok. This interaction did generate Western interest in the Hermit Kingdom and a special temptation for a handful of men. Men like James Joseph Dresnok. Dresnok was a U.S. soldier, and he'd had a rough life. His parents divorced when he was young. He'd never finished high school, and he had run-ins with the law before he enlisted at 17. He married young, but returned from a deployment in Germany to find his wife had left him for another man. When Dresnok was redeployed to South Korea in 1962, he had lost all hope and was treating his depression with alcohol. It didn't help that his behavior earned him a court-martial either. With no wife, no career, and no future, Dresnok decided that life in the DPRK couldn't possibly be worse than his current one. So, on August 15, 1962, Dresnok ran across a minefield in the demilitarized zone and straight into the arms of some rather shocked North Korean soldiers. Dresnok was interrogated, but they soon realized that he genuinely wished to live in North Korea. After initial hesitation, the regime accepted him. Dresnok was given a home and became a North Korean citizen. He was one of at least 7 known U.S. defectors to the country. In his new life in North Korea, Dresnok became an English teacher and sometimes acted in state propaganda films. He and the handful of other American defectors often played American soldiers in war films, and he became something of a celebrity in the country. Another defector who later returned to the West claimed that they were closely monitored by state security services and were sometimes beaten or interrogated on suspicion of being spies. But if this is true, it did not seem to deter Dresnok. Dresnok lived the rest of his life in North Korea. He married twice and had several children before dying in November 2016. His children remain in North Korea, where they hold important jobs and plan to remain there for the rest of their lives. Military of Kim Il-sung. Military of Kim Il-sung. A few defections like Dresnok were not going to redress the military imbalance between North Korea and the US, though. In the 1960s, Kim focused on rebuilding his decimated military, using the rebuilt economic strength of his nation to rearm and upgrade his massive army. The government coined the slogan, "Arms in one hand, hammer and sickle in the other," to emphasize the importance of the military to their vision of the country. North Korea continued to recruit soldiers into its military. All eligible citizens had to serve 8 years in one branch or another. Most of its equipment was still being given to them by the USSR and China well into the 1950s. Maybe 5% of its annual expenditure went to the military. Most in most nations, but not as high as it would be in later years. With no wars to fight, the soldiers were regularly assigned to work projects around the country, providing an easy labor force that could be deployed wherever the state needed them. On top of its obvious use, if war broke out, a strong military was a useful way to indoctrinate young people with state ideology. Kim wanted to inculcate military discipline in the next generation and required all children to practice with firearms, starting when they were 7 years old. This military resurgence had economic benefits too. Kim envisioned a militarily self-sufficient North Korea that could boost its economy by churning out a rifle for every citizen and enough tanks, planes, and artillery to match the South and its American allies. This concept was called Byungjin and argued that military development was deeply tied to economic development, and it has remained relevant in North Korean thought ever since. As the military grew in power, Kim purged unreliable officials. In the late 1960s, top military men like the Minister of National Security, the Chief of Southern Intelligence, and the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, along with at least 10 top generals, were removed from power. This was less a case of them being a threat and more a case of Kim simply tightening his control to replace these men with even more dependable allies. Communist power politics, while still providing economic aid to Pyongyang. Moscow and Beijing's relationship with the strange little regime was not smooth sailing. Moscow was still uncomfortable with Kim's personality cult, but it was China who was most unhappy with North Korea's poor performance in the Korean War had earned them a low opinion in China's political and military leadership, and the fact that China had to take up most of the manpower burden of the conflict created resentment against the Kim regime. Kim's tight control over the state also conflicted with Mao's enthusiasm for popular revolution. When Mao's Legion of Red Guards student activists launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966, waging a campaign of terror and vandalism against rival communist factions and symbols of Chinese tradition across the country, Kim Il-sung condemned them. To him, it was a dangerous act of popular unrest that risked undermining the stability of the country. The Red Guards had no love for him either and dubbed him a fat revisionist who was not worthy of being called a communist Korean DMZ conflict. Perhaps it was these wounds to his pride and questions about his credentials that made Kim Il-sung lash out at his enemies in 1966. Inspired by the work of the Viet Cong, Kim Il-sung devised plans for guerrilla infiltrators to slip across the DMZ and wreak havoc on the South. After over a decade of stalemate, it seemed he wanted to roll the dice on conflict once more. Incursions and even firefights along the DMs were not unheard of, and there were usually a few dozen encounters a year. However, in 1966, these increased tenfold. There were almost daily skirmishes as North Korean guerrillas were caught in South Korean territory. As tensions rose, border guards became more on edge and started to resolve disputes with aggression and gunfire. This period is sometimes called the Second Korean War, but there were no major battles. Rather than a concerted campaign, it was hundreds of tiny skirmishes and guerrilla attacks. There were casualties on both sides, and the U.S. declared the area around the demilitarized Zona Hostile Fire Zone, Blue House Raid. By far the most dire episode of the conflict was a daring and disastrous North Korean assassination attempt on the South Korean president. They were convinced that eliminating President Park Chung-hee, he wouldn't just weaken the South, but cause chaos from which the people would rise up, throw out the American occupiers, and embrace communism. On the night of January 17, 1968, 31 elite North Korean commandos slipped across the DMZ into the South. Their goal: infiltrate President Park's residence at the Blue House in Seoul and eliminate him. Each man and the team had been handpicked and trained in infiltration. They'd rehearsed this mission dozens of times, And most of all, they'd been pumped full of North Korean propaganda. They avoided detection for several days until they encountered 4 civilian woodcutters. These civilians might have feared death, but they were saved by the delusional propaganda of the North. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea had assured its people that these southern masses were oppressed and eager to embrace communism. The soldiers simply explained the virtues of communism to the men, promised that they'd all soon be joined in wonderful communist bliss, and let them go. Naturally, the men immediately reported them to the police. Within hours, the warning was relayed up the chain of command. South Korea didn't know what the commandos wanted, but they mobilized everything in the area to find them and put the whole country on high alert. The North Koreans managed to arrive in Seoul undetected, but they had to scuttle their original plan. They'd been trained well, though, and adapted to the high alert. With soldiers everywhere, the commandos simply blended in. They donned stolen South Korean uniforms. And on the 20th of January, the full group of 31 armed men walked down the street in open daylight towards the president's residence at the Blue House. The commandos got within 800 meters of the president's house before some curious policemen stopped them. It didn't take long for the police to see right through their disguises. Their cover blown, the commandos opened fire. One policeman died, and 2 North Koreans fell before the commandos scattered. A massive manhunt was launched in the following days. South Korean and American forces swept the city and countryside hunting down the scattered commandos. Of the 31 commandos, just 1 escaped back across the border. 1 more was captured, but all of the rest were killed. The Blue House raid was an embarrassment for both sides. The North Korean soldiers had foolishly blown their own cover and failed their mission. However, had the 4 civilians not warned the authorities, it is possible the commandos would have succeeded. Even then, with Seoul on high alert, the commandos had gotten within 800 meters of their target before being caught. The Blue House raid could have been the spark of a major war. But by sheer luck, it happened to occur just as the Tet Offensive exploded in Vietnam, dragging away US attention and guaranteeing that America would not commit to another war in Asia. For his part, Kim Il-sung denied involvement and blamed rogue elements in the government for the plan. But other actions by North Korea at the same time paint a different picture. The conflict peaks. A mere 3 days after the Blue House raid, North Korea captured a U.S. recon ship off the coast of the peninsula. The USS Pueblo was performing intelligence gathering several miles off the coast when it was intercepted by the North Korean Navy and Air Force. Officially, the Pueblo was in international waters, but North Korea has always asserted a much larger sea border than other countries accept. The North Koreans pursued the ship when it tried to flee and fired several warning shots, killing 1 sailor before the Pueblo surrendered and its crew was taken prisoner. It took several days to confirm the ship's fate, and Washington scrambled for a response. They desperately wanted to avoid making things worse. Not only might the hostages be killed, but U.S. resources were consumed dealing with Tet Offensive in Vietnam. All the while, the crew suffered the misery and torture of North Korean captivity. The North began stockpiling rations, and in early 1968, Pyongyang closed its schools and evacuated citizens to the countryside in anticipation of a nuclear attack. Over 100 infiltrators were sent to the south again in late October, but almost all of them were caught within weeks of and that left about 150 people on both sides dead. The murder of an entire family at Gabang Mountain by the infiltrators, including a 10-year-old boy, intensified the South Korean response and made hope of a South Korean pro-communist uprising even more absurd. The global community feared war. Diplomats from communist, capitalist, and non-aligned nations urged de-escalation. Even Moscow was unhappy. During a party conference in April 1968, Premier Brezhnev condemned North Korea for trying to drag the world into another conflict. We do not know what exactly led Kim Il-sung to wind down the provocations in 1969 as the anger of the USSR and China, fear of actual conflict or a changing domestic political and economic situation might all explain it. We only know that for whatever reason, Pyongyang eased off on the provocations over the following months, and by late 1969, the crew of the Pueblo were released and hostile encounters along the demilitarized zone had returned to their pre-1966 levels. It is possible that Kim's massive military buildup in the 1960s created the appetite for war. It is also likely that the purge of North Korean generals in the late 1960s was a direct result of the failures of this whole conflict. Overall, though, it was a pointless conflict that claimed an estimated 400 South Korean and American lives, along with 100s of North Koreans. Prosperity in the 60s and 70s. North Korea's military fortunes were poor, but its economic prosperity at this point was not so dire. Per capita GDP in the North was comparable or even higher than that of the South well into the 1960s and 70s. More than just rebuilding, North Korea had upgraded too. Almost all homes had electricity by the mid-1970s, and almost 70% of the population had urbanized as agricultural improvements reduced the need for people to be rural farmers. Education also improved with virtually all children enrolled in school and over 200 universities established across the country, all with free tuition, of course. One of the biggest success stories in North Korea was and remains national health. The hospitals remain underfunded. However, mandatory health checkups and vaccination programs instituted under Kim Il-sung have left North Korea with an unusually high life expectancy and a low infant mortality rate, despite its relative poverty. To this day, North Korea enjoys an average life expectancy of about 73 years, lower than the US or other developed countries, but considerably higher than other nations of comparable economic status. Still, Kim's promises far exceeded reality. He'd once claimed he would see North Korea where everyone wore silk, lived in a house with a tiled roof, and ate 3 full meals a day. North Korea had made progress, but this dream of luxury, a dream that was already reality for millions in the West, was still a distant hope. What's more, North Korea's progress towards that distant hope was about to come to a grinding halt. A Desperate Nation, 1973-1994. A Desperate Nation. Economic issues. By the mid-1970s, North Korea's economy was showing signs of struggle. The Cholima movement had exhausted its workforce, and production was steadily declining. Imports of advanced Western machinery had stalled when it became obvious that Pyongyang would not be able to pay its debts. Global economic challenges throughout the decade, including the 1973 oil crisis, had knock-on effects that shook the already fragile nation. In 1976, North Korea was forced to stop all debt repayments to the West, a dire sign of the state of the nation's finances. Manipulation of statistics also continued to be a problem. Success varied wildly in different parts of the economy, and already, by 1968, the government had stopped publishing specific data on economic output to avoid scrutiny. Some industries like ceramic soared, and the government smashed these numbers together with massive underperformance in other industries to create the illusion of success for propaganda purposes. By not recognizing their failures, though, the government only made it worse, continuing to pour resources into overperforming industries when they could have been better spent elsewhere. Things were not all bad. By many metrics, life in the 1970s North Korea was relatively good, at least in the first half of the decade. Residential construction projects had finally addressed the housing shortages that plagued the country since the war, and there had been undeniable development in both industry and agriculture. However, the North would soon fall rapidly behind its southern neighbors in terms of prosperity, quality of life, and industrial output. Pyongyang tried to save its flagging economy with the August 3rd Consumer Goods Movement, which was basically a campaign to get North Koreans to buy useless goods they didn't need. And that didn't last just to create demand and boost GDP numbers. Attempts to restart the Cholima campaign for the movement failed. The exhausted workforce produced poor products, which meant even more had to be made to replace them, creating an endless cycle of decreasing quality and increasing demand that further warped economic statistics. North Korea's pride especially suffered as its old rivals in the South and in Japan began rapid economic rises that catapulted them ahead in the 1970s. As South Korea soared, North Korea became increasingly dependent on its Soviet and Chinese allies. By the end of the decade, North Korea was effectively a vassal state of the USSR, relying on them for economic subsidies and diplomatic muscle, and watching as its enemies soared ahead towards prosperity. Foreign policy changes. The shifting winds of global politics presented new challenges for North Korea. After the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam, Kim entertained the idea of reunification with the South. If Vietnam could defeat the U.S., he argued, surely North Korea could. Kim presented this possibility to Mao Zedong, but this was not 1951 anymore. North Korea's military advantage over the South had shrunk dramatically, and the US's embarrassment in a guerrilla war spoke little of its power to win a conventional one. Furthermore, Beijing had not forgotten that their soldiers had shouldered most of the fighting burden after saving Kim's last disastrous war attempt. Frankly, they did not trust Pyongyang to win. The other reason they refused to support the idea was China's newfound effort to build bridges with the West. By the mid-1970s, China was looking for ways to reduce hostilities to the US and build economic ties. The Nixon administration had been eager to do so, hoping to deepen the divides between Moscow and Beijing, and allowing North Korea to start another war would only ruin those efforts. Kim's plans were shelved when he began to realize that the old reliance on China and the USSR in an eternal union against the West was crumbling. To counter this, Kim Il-sung found new allies outside of China and Russia. Fellow communists like Pol Pot in Cambodia were rather short-lived allies. One of the more successful areas of North Korean diplomacy was Africa. Kim found fast friends in the continent's mad dictators like Idi Amin and Jean Bedel Bokassa, men whose craving for power and control matched his own. The black girl from Pyongyang, Monique Nguema. The black girl from Pyongyang. Another appropriately psychotic friend Kim made was Francisco Macias Nguema, the ruthless dictator of Equatorial Guinea. Nguema turned his country into his own little hellish cult. His official nickname was the Great Miracle, and priests said to give praise to him in every service. Of course, he shared the bloodlust of North Korea too. In one instance, Nguema had 200 people massacred in a football stadium while blasting pop music over the speakers. Equatorial Guinea was easily one of the worst places in the world to live. They called it the Auschwitz of Africa for good reason. As a sign of their friendship, Nguema sent his daughter Monica to be raised and educated in Pyongyang in 1979. It was just in the nick of time, too, since Nguema was ousted and killed months later. But Kim Il-sung kept his promise to his depraved departed friend. Monica was given the best education that North Korea could provide. And Kim regularly called Monica to see how she was doing and made sure she had everything she wanted. Monica is still alive and proudly considers Kim Il-sung to be her second father. She has written several books about her life and family, where she adamantly defends both Nguema and Kim Il-sung's good men who were unfairly smeared by Western propaganda. Operation Paul Bunyan. Operation Paul Bunyan. But while North Korea built closer alliances with some nations, relations with the United States and South Korea continued to be difficult. The DMZ remained a tinderbox that could be ignited by the simplest thing, including a tree. On August 18, 1976, a small group of U.S. and South Korean soldiers, led by Captain Arthur Boniface and Lieutenant Mark Barrett, entered the DMZ to cut down a tree, which was blocking the view for a UN command post on the border. a group of North Korean soldiers came over and watched them closely. After a while, the North Koreans became belligerent. They demanded Captain Boniface and his men stop and leave, but Boniface turned his back to them and kept working. He didn't even see the North Korean soldiers when they suddenly and brutally attacked him. About 30 North Korean soldiers armed with crowbars, metal pipes, and other implements pounced on the US and South Korean soldiers. Captain Boniface was beaten to death on the spot. Lieutenant Barrett escaped to a nearby ditch where the North Korean soldiers found him and attacked him with the same axes the soldiers had been using to cut down the tree. Boniface and Barrett both died from their injuries. Both men were armed but never drew their weapons, probably scared that gunfire would only make things worse. Immediately, North Korean state media spun the attack as an act of American aggression, and North Korea's international allies echoed this propaganda. Video, photographic, and eyewitness evidence refuted it, but the regime made sure that the North Korean people only saw their version of events. But if Pyongyang had hoped the US would back down, they were badly mistaken. The US refused to take the murder of 2 of their soldiers lightly, but they also didn't want to start a war over a tree. Cue Operation Paul Bunyan, named for the famous lumberjack folk hero. The US had a single goal. They were going to cut that tree down, and they were going to dare Pyongyang to try and stop them. The US called in an army's worth of resources, hundreds of armed soldiers, martial arts specialists, armored vehicles, attack helicopters, a fleet of bombers, fighter jets, and not to mention the aircraft carrier, USS Midway, which was moved to a station offshore. Practically every US and Allied military base in East Asia was put on full alert, ready to assist if the North Koreans tried to stop them cutting that tree. With enough firepower to conquer a small country behind them, the US sent a team into the DMZ to chop down the tree once and for all. A few 100 North Korean soldiers on the border could only watch in awe as the US troops brought it down, while helicopters and bombers circled on the horizon. Minutes later, Operation Paul Bunyan was declared a success. The stump was left standing for a few years, and now a memorial stands on the spot to honor Boniface and Barrett. North Korea, apparently shocked by the lengths the US would go for a tree, didn't go so far as to apologize, but Kim Il-sung expressed his regret that the incident had gotten out of hand and said both sides needed to commit to keeping the peace. It wasn't much, but it was the closest the Kim regime had come to accepting responsibility for something bad in its entire history thus far. Flagpole War. The Paul Bunyan incident didn't solve issues along the DMZ, not by a long shot, but subsequent disagreements were generally more civil. In fact, they could be downright silly at times. The Flagpole War of the 1980s was a good example, and it's exactly what it sounded like. South Korea erected a 98-meter flagpole near the border so that their flag could be seen by the North. Taking some lessons from the showmanship of their American rivals, the North answered back with a 160-meter flagpole that dwarfed their neighbors. The flag alone weighed almost 600 pounds, and to this day, this little sign of North Korean vanity is the tallest flagpole in the world. The emergence of Kim Jong-il. Emergence of Kim Jong-il. By 1980, Kim Il-sung was pushing 70. North Korea's economic progress had stagnated, and foreign relations had been stuck in a perpetual stalemate for almost 3 decades. There might have been a sense of anxiety about what could happen when the great leader died, and the nation faced its mounting problems alone. Kim Il-sung had a solution to those anxieties, and its name was Kim Jong-il. Jong-il was hidden from the spotlight for the first 30 years of his life. Born in a Soviet military camp in 1941 to Kim Il-sung and his first wife, Kim's childhood is obscured behind a ridiculous level of absurd and fancy-full stories. Kim Jong-il first emerged into the corridors of power in the 1970s, playing a key role in party politics, even as he was hidden from public view. He joined the Central Committee in 1972, and by 1974, he was the designated heir to his father. Il was groomed for succession through experience. He was given important roles in managing espionage and propaganda for the regime, and would gradually accrue more power behind the scenes until the 1990s. From the 1980s, he was put into public view and given a thorough heroic treatment by propaganda. Soon, his portrait could be found alongside his father's in every home in the DPRK. Kim Jong-il was described as the party center, and state propaganda assured the people that as Kim Sung's old age approached, the party center would maintain the revolution and continue the work that his father began. Kidnapping of Shin Sang-ok and Choi Yoon-hee. Kidnapping of Shin Sang-ok and Choi Yoon-hee, one of Kim Jong-il's first responsibilities was to coordinate propaganda to improve the DPRK case's image. Despite his ideological opposition to Western ideas, Kim Jong-il was famously a huge film buff and owned a massive collection of foreign films that would have earned a regular North Korean a trip to the labor camps. Working with the Propaganda and Agitation Department, Kim Jong-il dreamed of making North Korea a sort of communist Hollywood. Instead of themes of freedom or tales of cowboys and U.S. soldiers, like the Americans made, he dreamed of a film industry that sang the praises of communism and retold the glories of Kim Il-sung and his glorious revolution. The trouble was that North Korea didn't have the people to make films that could compete with Hollywood. Kim Jong-il made a few of his own during the 1970s, but any applause they got from the North Korean audience was forced. Kim knew he needed people with talent to make his dream come true, and he knew where to find them. In January 1978, North Korean agents approached South Korean actress Choi Yoon-hee while she was in Hong Kong. They shoved her onto a boat and took her back to North Korea, where she was given a tour of the country and met Kim Il-sung. Despite her kidnapping, Choi was treated well and spent time with Kim visiting theaters, operas, and parties across the country. 6 months later, North Korean agents swept up another South Korean film expert in Hong Kong, the director Shin Sang-ok. Shin happened to be Choi's ex-husband, and Kim intentionally kidnapped both to reunite them in North Korea and compel them to stay to make films for him. After several failed escape attempts from Shin, they gave in. Choi and Shin remarried and spent the next 8 years pumping out movies for the regime. Some of the films were exactly what you'd expect. Film productions of Kim Jong-il's own screenplay, or tales of Kim Il-sung's glorious resistance against the Japanese. Choi even won an award for her performance in one propaganda film about a peasant woman joining the communists in Japanese-occupied China. But the best film had to be Pulgasari, a North Korean Godzilla ripoff about a magic dragon that overthrows a corrupt emperor. You can watch the film online. Kenpachiro Satsuma, one of the actors who played Godzilla, admitted that Pulgasari was actually better than some of the Godzilla films. Unfortunately, there would be no sequel. Choi and Shin were well treated, but they were still prisoners. During a visit to Vienna to secure funding for their next big hit, they managed to sneak away from their North Korean guards and escaped to the U.S. Embassy. North Korea's film industry would never see wonders like Pulgasari again, but at least Choi and Shin could finally be free. Rangoon Bombing Seed Bearing Program, Choi and Shin were not the only people kidnapped and taken in North Korea in this period, and many would not have the chance to escape. Throughout the 1970s, Pyongyang kidnapped hundreds of foreigners and smuggled them back to the DPRK. Most of the targets were taken from Japan, although kidnappings from other countries like France and Malaysia were also known. There was no real pattern to them. They would occur at any place at any time. Sometimes taking young couples, other times a lone man, or even a 13-year-old girl. The victims would be taken to North Korea and forced to live in the country for the rest of their lives. If they were abducted as a couple, they would be split up for a time and then reunited after a thorough indoctrination.